men, Grandpa. Yeah, Grandpa, what are men?
Eh? Huh? What's that? Oh, yes, men. Well, there ain't no men in the world no more, sonnies. No more men. But as I remember the critters, they was, they was like monsters.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and a very Merry Christmas to all. My name is Ian Garcia. With me is my father, Rocco.
Hello.
And this is Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. We decided that since it was the season that we'd get a little weird with it. We're talking about 3 topics this evening. We're going to be going over an animated short from 1939 called Peace on Earth, and then we're going to be moving a little further into our typical terrain with the Twilight Zone episode Night of the Meek, and we're going to cap it all off with the rather notorious cult film Santa Claus Conquers the Martians. So, right off the bat, let's start with Peace on Earth. Had you seen this before I showed it to you last night?
I may have, but I don't remember. I may have.
Why don't you describe to me your immediate impressions after seeing Peace on Earth? What stuck out to you about it?
Well, I think I didn't have much notice of the actual film when it opened. It was kind of bizarre that helmets were used as houses in the opening scenes. Which made me think that had something to do with a war-related cartoon. But I didn't know that until you got into the actual meat of the story. It was okay. I don't think it was necessarily a shocking kind of cartoon. Maybe it wasn't meant to be, because obviously it was meant for a broad audience.
Yeah, Peace on Earth, it's a very odd outlier in the history of early animation.
Who did it, by the way?
It was produced by...
Looney Tunes, or no?
No. So, Peace on Earth is an MGM cartoon. It was produced by Hugh Harman and Rudolph Ising, which, they ran Harman Ising production... Not Harman Ising, but Harman Ising Productions, which was a sort of independently contracted studio that did a lot of animations that were distributed by MGM. It's a very odd cartoon because in one way it is totally typical of cartoons of that period from the 20s to the 30s, particularly those produced by MGM, which is that it's very naive, very sentimental, very even kind of saccharinely cutesy. It's the characters in it are or the frame narrative at least is told from the perspective of a bunch of anthropomorphic squirrels. That it's Christmas Day and Grandpa has showed up at the house and he's telling them a story around the fireplace. But it's also an anti-war film. As you alluded to, it opens in a very bizarre way because the first shot of the short is of troops or soldiers obscurely running through just this totally blasted out city that is on fire, and then we cut to the scene with the animal characters, and as you say, the houses that they're living in are all fashioned from helmets that have been left behind from the battle. And there's also some other very morbid imagery. Like, the first thing I realized rewatching it was that it opens on a shot of a ruined church, and the stained glass window that depicts Jesus walking with 2 lambs, the face has been blown out. You can see the body, but the face has been removed, and it creates this sense of cognitive dissonance that's produced by the movie between how sentimental and stereotypically cutesy all of the animal characters and their story is presented as versus what is the actual content of the film, which is incredibly dire and morbid and very pessimistic about the future of mankind. And so I guess in the 30s, the market for these sort of short animations, they were almost all exclusively comedies or musical variety subjects. And they were either produced in-house by animation departments of the studios, the most successful of those being Warner Brothers and MGM, or they were hired out to independent contractors, which is how you get the most successful animation of the studios of the time, Walt Disney Productions, who were distributed first by Columbia Pictures and then by RKO Radio Pictures. All you need to know really about this early period of American commercial animation is the way that they're packaged, like Warner Brothers, their cartoon series were called Silly Symphonies and Looney Tunes. The Disney shorts were called Merry Melodies. The MGM shorts were called Happy Harmonies. So they're all emphasizing sentimentality, humor, and most of all, music. And there's besides animation quality, because again, Disney's production tended to be much higher above their competitors in terms of just how rigorous and realistic their animations were and how story-driven their shorts were, as opposed to merely being like Warner Brothers, where they tended to be just reviews for their vast library of popular music. But at the same time, they're virtually all indistinguishable in terms of content and form. And so we're coming to this very late period where Peace on Earth, yes, it does have those sort of comedy and musical elements to it. And in fact, I guess in some ways, the comedy of the short, it's not just that it creates this interesting contrast with the anti-war sentiment of the film, it's that sometimes it just feels a little too saccharine and inappropriate. Like at one point, the grandpa is talking about, the propensity for human beings to wage wars over seemingly minor circumstances, and one of the ways this is represented is by a war between meat eaters and vegetarians. And so it's a very cutesy way of framing this rather horrific thing, and I don't know that it necessarily works.
I never could figure 'em out. They was the orneriest, cussedest, dag-nabbed tribe of varmints I ever did see. Why, there was always a fight, and a feud, and a shooting one another. They'd no sooner get one argument settled than they'd find something else to fuss about. If it wasn't one darn thing, it was another. But when they couldn't think of nothing else to wrangle over, the flat-footed people started a-shooting at the buck-toothed people, and the vegetarians began to fight the meat-eating people, and you couldn't make head nor tail of it.
But it's basically, in terms of what makes it unique, is that it's kind of the first, or at least to my knowledge, one of the first of these kinds of shorts where, even to the extent that it has a moral subject, it's a subject that is implicating whole societies and nations and the way they conduct their relationships with one another, rather than just being like moralistic stories about individual people's moral failings or teaching by negative example.
Right, and I like the way they sort of like mechanized humans. I mean, humans are just, there's no real show of face or anything. It's basically outlines. Either they're in gas masks, and that's the way they're portrayed. He says these people have these huge eyes with the nose and the snout and the tube that goes down to the belly. Yeah, which is, of
course, the gas mask that they're wearing and the helmets. Right. All of it, and their bayonets. It is really cool because the grandfather does describe it in those terms, where the way he's presenting the story to his children is that human beings are basically these monsters that, like you're saying, they're like mechanical in nature. They're almost like robots.
They wore great big iron pots on their heads. They walked on their hind legs, and they carried terrible-looking shooting irons with knives on the end of them. And their eyes flashed, and they had tremendous big snoots, like this, that curled down and fastened onto their stomachs.
Gee. Oh, Grandpa, I'm glad there ain't no more men around. Guys, me too.
Some of the animation of, like, the squirrel characters, particularly as it's being in its more sentimental or comedic mode, the animation there is really quite mediocre, and sometimes it's just outright bad, but once it gets into the war segments, it's very successfully atmospheric and very well detailed, and it's one of those things where I'm kind of flummoxed as to find a way to put my ideas together about it, because I keep trying to reconcile that the sort of cutesy sentimental framing of it with the horrificness of the subject matter, and how it seems like it's very clearly drawn directly from the experiences of the First World War, either by people who fought in it or people who were indirectly exposed to the aftermath of it. And I guess more or less the reason I keep emphasizing the year in which the movie was made in 1939 is that this is very soon on the heels of the United States once again entering into an international war that is going to implicate most major nations on the earth. But the tenor that was left over from the First World War of basically just staunch pacifism and a total moral rejection of war altogether, just because of the sheer horrificness and seemingly pointlessness of the First World War. That is, at the time Peace on Earth is being made, that's all about, the script on that is all about to be completely flipped. And
right.
Especially in American cartoons, that they themselves are going to be completely mobilized for propaganda purposes by that point.
Well, yeah, because you had a real existential threat at the time, which was Germany. So that was less of a people arguing over being vegetarians or meat eaters.
Right.
It wasn't that simple.
Well, Germany...
Even the First World War wasn't that facetious. It wasn't... there's a certain... I understand what the point of the... it's a cartoon. Obviously, these people had a motive in mind, obviously, about the futility of war, but there was no reconciling with Hitler. I'm sorry. There was no way.
Well, I think that's the thing, and with the First World War, very soon after it happened, there was very much this popular awareness of the idea that this was not a war that was fought for any kind of humanitarian or just purpose, that it was mostly an autocratic dispute. And it's interesting because, with the First World War and then the Great Depression soon after, this was a period where there was a definite uptick in leftist and left-leaning ideology in the country, because both of these events were incredibly traumatic, not just in the physical sense that, millions of people died and were forced into destitution because of them, but because they seemed to run so contrary to pre-ingrained national myths that, America is a city on a hill, we fight for what's righteous, we are leading the way into a greater future. And so when people look for answers as to how that project could go so horrifically wrong, it makes it possible for there to be more popularly accepted elements of leftist ideology. And I think that is part of the story of Peace on Earth, and not just Peace on Earth, but Hollywood before the Second World War, where, it wasn't precisely okay to talk about, socialistic or communistic or anti-capitalist messages in movies, much less pacifistic ones in films. But there was definitely a much more robust and critical element of the left in Hollywood, which you can see in both live action features as well as in short animated subjects like Peace on Earth. And while the Second World War is going to very much redirect the ideological trend there, and Peace on Earth stands as a, even without Hitler in mind, it stands as a...
The cartoon, it goes beyond that. The cartoon says, yes, there may be righteous periods, there may be less than righteous periods of war, but the point is that there's always war until finally they annihilate the Earth.
Yeah.
And they crawl out of the ashes, very, very similar to the Big Bang in evolution, or not Big Bang, but when the catastrophic destruction 65 million years ago, where mammals emerged on the face of the earth. It's very, very similar to that, where everything's killed, and what do you have? Small mammals that were warm-blooded, that were able to rise, and it would give us a whole new series, right?
Yeah, it's a post-apocalyptic film.
Right.
That takes for granted that war is going to continue exponentially.
Exactly, right.
And that eventually it's going to produce a mass extinction event.
Exactly, right. So it really has a fatalistic kind of view to it.
But also a subversive one, because the way they choose to tell that story is through the mechanism of what cartoons were at the time. So I guess there's still that element of it almost feels like the cutesy animal stuff is at times even supposed to be like willfully saccharine, so that it contrasts even more with the deliberate message of the short, that there's a subversive element going on.
In 1939, the only backdrop that they have to refer to is World War One. It's just a distillation, if you will.
Peace on Earth, you really can use it as a signpost for not only a complete switch in the politicization of American film, whereas before you have this very evident undercurrent of subversive ideology that'll then change, which will then be converted to total patriotism, total.
No, I don't think so.
Propaganda.
I think what it says is that man is not capable of peace on earth. In fact, why do we say peace on earth, goodwill to men? Well, it's because that's the only thing we don't have to, that's the only metaphor we have.
Yeah, that's the other weird thing, because that's
we can't say goodwill to chipmunks. I mean,
that's the other weird thing is that like the squirrels, they sing the song.
What does that mean? Goodwill to men. What is that? Right?
They sing "Hark the Herald Angel."
Right.
But they're and then then the children ask Grandpa, "Wait, what are men? What does that mean?"
Right.
And
exactly.
And it's this weird thing where the animals themselves seem to have appropriated the strict semantics of what human beings have left behind.
Right, it's like all clear in a time machine.
Yeah.
What did all clear mean? All clear was the sirens go off, but all clear became the clarion call for those people to be eaten by the submersives.
Right, but as far as like the movie, like not just in terms of the movie. Well, the movie being a sort of signpost for a change in American films and in American ideology with regards to war. It wasn't like, the war started and suddenly all of that subversiveness went away. Like, even as late as 1942, you get, like, a cartoon like Donald Gets Drafted, which... even as late as 1942, it's presenting a decidedly satirical view of recruitment, because the idea is that Donald is in the army now.
But the army, Costello.
Right, but the army is kind of bullshit. The army is kind of like the first thing it needs to do is just drill your individualism out of you.
Well, that's true all the time, right?
Well, right.
Because the mission's the most important thing.
Right.
Right. So that's without saying. I mean, if you prepare for war. Spartans, what are we?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. What is your profession? Yeah, but it's also interesting how the mobilization of cartoons, in particular, to be wartime.
I'm surprised this got released. Tell you the truth, it's very, very bizarre, don't you think?
No, it is. Well, it's bizarre looking back at it now, because it's so overtly pacifistic. But I think obviously there were already elements in American popular and political society that were pushing for America to become more involved in the war in Europe, either indirectly or
Sure.
directly. But there was also, as we see in Peace on Earth, there was still this heavy post-First World War undercurrent.
Right.
Where it was, no, it doesn't matter what the individual circumstances are.
Yeah,
this is all just.
Maybe that's what it was. Maybe it was actually a warning not to get involved in the next one. Because
That's what I'm wondering.
The Weimar Republic fell in 1936, I guess.
Yeah, 35, 36.
When it collapsed, right?
You
I
know,
think this is a leftist cartoon.
Well, yeah, definitely. That's what I mean. Is that like
that snuck under the radar and was probably pushed by executives in movie theater, executives of movies. That put this on because
this is the thing. I don't think anyone at an executive level, except for Fred Quimby, who executive produced a lot of the MGM cartoons and would go on to be the major producer behind William Hanna and Joseph Barbera's tenor as basically the flagship animation producers and directors for MGM. But what I was getting at in terms of the explicit leftism of the film, as far as how Hugh Harman and Rudolph Ising present it, it's one of those cases where I don't know that it even necessarily needed to sneak under the radar, because while the Production Code Authority at the time was very hostile to leftist or anti-capitalist ideology, it was also a fact that, like we said, like cartoons at this time were incredibly saccharine and incredibly moralistic. So it's my feeling that even something like Peace on Earth, which does, there's no direct rendering of an anti-capitalist critique of war. That it still fundamentally just presents a generic, non-exclusive opposition to war in general. It's pacifistic, not necessarily left pacifist. Mm-hmm. But I think there is this fundamental...
No, I think it's nihilistic.
Right. There's this fundamental... pessimistic.
It's nihilistic.
Like, it believes in something. It's not an absence of belief.
I think it says that man can't help himself.
It says that man can't help himself, but it also presents a scenario where something of man is inherently preserved and rises from the ashes in form of... Because that's the other interesting thing is that, and I really noted this being the third time I think that I've watched this short. I usually watch it every Christmas, but it's the first time that I noticed that when the last man is killed in the final Great World War that's depicted in the film.
Right.
And all that's left are the ruins and all their stuff that's left behind. When the animals all crawl out, the thing that I realized is that the animals here aren't as anthropomorphized. They crawl on all fours. They don't have any clothing. None of them speak yet until they speak to the owl, who is, they all go...
The wise owl.
Yeah, they convene on a church, and the wise old Mr. Owl is reading the 10 Commandments, and he's like, well, awful good book of rules here. I guess they just didn't follow it very well.
Thou shalt not kill. Looks like a mighty good book of rules. But I guess them men didn't pay much attention to it.
But once they've become exposed to the Bible, that is then presented in the story as the framing for then they come to inhabit the ruins of humanity. And not only that, then that's when they have clothes and they have culture. They become, and not only anthropomorphized, but it's almost suggested that like basically Christ... They've evolved, but it's like almost like a miraculous thing, like their exposure to the Word of God.
Right.
At least this
2001.
This Christian interpretation of it has elevated them above being animals. So that's what I mean by how the film presents as there's an element of humanity that still perseveres despite even the apocalyptic threat of war. It just hangs that totally on the mantle of a kind of pacifistic Christianity, not a political solution, but a religious solution. And like you were saying, in terms of how it being a theme of control, ultimately the film is coming down on the side of not necessarily a leftist critique of war again, but a critique of war which emphasizes the need for a greater structuring of a society around a sort of fear of and reckoning with a higher power and a sort of surrender to the grace of that power. And it becomes really stark in that fact, because then you remember, oh right, it's a movie that's taking place on Christmas. There's this heavy religious.
Yeah, but it's bereft of well, because it's a cartoon.
Right.
I'm sorry, but this was not meant for kids. It's bereft of It's bereft of logic. I mean, there's no.
Well, there's no specific critique. It's just war. War is almost like this It's just sin.
What if the squirrels and the chipmunks start to have war? I mean,
that's the thing. They just don't, because they're innocent animals, and
right.
but they're also sort of just naive, because all these again, it's like this. It's this issue of how all these older cartoons from the period were kind of dire, and just how sentimental and childlike all of these sort of animal characters are presented. And so here it becomes this thing where, the only solution to, humanity destroying itself with war is just this rising from the ashes of these naive children who have basically submitted totally to a kind of sentimental control by a higher power, but it isn't necessarily rooted, like you're saying, it's not rooted in a critique of the actual causes of war. It presents war itself as just like a sin, like it's thou shalt not kill, where it's like, okay, well, that's all well and good, but that's
rendered as pointless.
Right, exactly. Like, war doesn't happen because of willful malice and the desire to kill. War happens because there are mechanisms that are beyond the control of most people. And, as we know, putting God into the equation, putting Christ into the equation, that doesn't necessarily stop political machines themselves from propagandizing religion itself in order to achieve its own ends. But it remains, in that sense, very interesting as a turning point film, because it is so saccharine, it is so consistent with just like the candy sweet musical review light comedy aesthetics of those classic 30s cartoons. But then once cartoons become mobilized for war, suddenly you see in cartoons a drastic increase in not sentimentality, but sadism. Particularly like, if you have a character like Bugs Bunny fighting the Japanese, or Daffy Duck literally being shot in a cannon to Germany to bonk Hitler on the head with a giant hammer.
Right.
There seems to be this, not only an anti-pacifistic message, but there's this acclamation of American popular culture to a completely new way of looking at the possibilities of animation. It seems almost like the war itself basically gave cartoon makers the impetus where it's like, oh wait, we don't need to make moral fairy tales anymore. We don't need to make these naive moralistic stories about characters learning by negative example. We can just have senseless violence, and it is telling that it even during this post-war period, this is also when Tom and Jerry comes into existence, which, it's like, I'm not a particular fan of the Tom and Jerry shorts, but they are kind of just the most distilled and rarefied example of how American animation changed from a medium that trafficked mostly in musical comedy to being one that trafficked mostly in very violent slapstick humor, where the emphasis is not on any kind of moral justification. It's all about the pleasure of seeing the misfortune of someone else, whether they're getting diced up when they run through a screen door or something like that. I do think it is telling that Fred Quimby, the producer of Peace on Earth, his last film as a producer came in 1955, and it is actually a remake of Peace on Earth, called Goodwill to Men. You know, it's animated differently because this time it's under the direction of William Hanna and Joseph Barbera. And the character designs, you know, they've been updated to basically they're not squirrels, but they're mice that look like, you know, Jerry the Mouse. And then the short also adds the twist of course, implicating nuclear weapons as the ultimate source of what is going to be humanity's undoing. I think the remake is kind of stuffier than Peace on Earth, but it's weird that I think it's very telling to me that, you know, someone like Fred Quimby, who produced the original cartoon Peace on Earth and then had an incredibly successful career throughout the 40s, you know, in the post-Second World War period where, you know, America had rode in on a new wave of patriotism and anti-pacifism and anti-pessimism to a kind of very uncritical moment in its history, which then sort of gave rise to all of the disasters of the 60s and the 70s, especially in terms of our continued wars and the sort of imperialistic nature of our wars throughout the 50s and the 60s. And I just think it's telling that Quimby himself, it's almost like as his last hurrah, he's going back to the pre-Second World War pacifism at a time where, you know, like the sentiment of, you know, that, you know, it's almost like this necessary invocation of the idea that, okay, there was a very particular time where we felt we needed to mobilize ourselves to fight this specific enemy, but now that it's 1955, it's 10 years later, we have to reckon with the fact that the same exact problem of war is still there. And the solution is the same. Is basically Christ needs to redeem us, but you know, it's the same sort of thing of, you know, there is an irrevocable contradiction between humanity's continued existence and what seems to be just the exponential nature of war itself in an increasingly industrializing and technologically advanced society.
And that was the end of the last man on Earth.
Since we're already talking about the war, I did want to use that as a way to segue into our discussion of the creator and writer of the second piece that we watched in... This is the first topic of Monster Craze Memoirs where we're not covering a movie. This is an episode from the second season of Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone, which even when you just say The Twilight Zone, it rides very high in terms of the legacy of television as a popular medium that could also be used for artistic purposes. You know, it's not necessarily directly related to the plot of the episode, but I think going a little bit into Rod Serling's pre-television history, it pays well to segue from the Second World War into the Night of the Meek, because while the Night of the Meek doesn't involve war in any way, its placement in the Twilight Zone series, a series which was very frequently pacifistic in terms of its message, or anti-racist, or anti-fascistic, you know, it's a series that was very much geared and seemingly premised on a kind of not so understated liberal opposition to contemporary conservatism. So I guess I'll just stop beating around the bush and, you know, like at the outset of the Second World War, Rod Serling, he was still in high school. In his senior year, he was the editor of the high school newspaper at Binghamton High School in upstate New York. He encouraged his fellow students to support the war effort, including enlistment, and he himself wanted to join before graduating, but he was eventually discouraged by a civics teacher because he, you know, basically saying, look, wars are temporary, you know, you can't go back to high school again. You gotta get your diploma first, and then you can do whatever you want. Well, he gets his diploma, and the very next day after graduation, he enlists. He's ultimately made a paratrooper in the 511th Regiment of the 11th Airborne Division, and he was assigned to the Pacific Theater in 1944, which very much, which was discouraging to him personally, because Rod Serling, while he eventually converted to Unitarianism when he got married, he was a devout Jew his entire life, and he had specifically hoped that he would be, killing Nazis in the war, so he was rather disappointed when he was sent to the Pacific Theater. He participated in the Battle of Leyte, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the Battle of Leyte in the Philippines, but for a variety of reasons, including his growing reputation for some insubordination and a candidness of his opinions when it came to talking with superior officers or working with his fellow soldiers, he was eventually reassigned to the 511th's demolition team, nicknamed the Death Squad for its high mortality rate. So that's the beginning of Rod Serling's war career, where he's a guy who goes into the war with, I guess a teenager's very enthusiastic and devoted idea that he's going to be the guy who kills a lot of the bad people. But then he finally gets there, and it actually turns out that he's really not necessarily cut out for the army life. He was apparently not a particularly useful soldier. He kind of lacked the instinct and the aggressiveness when it came to acting in the field, and he was given to exploring the places he was stationed on his own against the orders of his superiors, and he frequently just got lost in the process. He was very much a fish out of water. This is something that he thought he wanted to do more than anything, but then when he actually gets there, he's constantly bucking up against precisely what we talked about with Peace on Earth in terms of the mobilization of the war effort. Like, he's not the kind of guy that you're going to drill his individualism out of him. He's not the kind of guy who really accepts that there is a hierarchy to people, that he thinks that his opinion is worth just as much as any general's. And as far as his experiences of the war itself, he claimed to have had nightmares and flashbacks for the rest of his life, so it seems like he had a certain degree of post-traumatic stress from his experiences, which, if you knew, and the war is hell in general, but if you know anything about the Pacific Theater, you know that was a particularly traumatic place for anybody to be a soldier. So this was politically a very formative experience for him in terms of the development of his politics, because he doesn't come out of the Second World War with a sort of naive conception of America being this uniquely powerful nation that, altered the course of history forever and for good. If anything, he was sort of so horrified by his experiences that it produced a very strident pacifism in him. And you see that come about in a lot of his works, not just in episodes of The Twilight Zone. He obviously also wrote or co-wrote the film Planet of the Apes, where the twist ending... I'm sorry if you're the one person on the earth who doesn't already know the twist ending of Planet of the Apes before you've seen it. The reason the planet is ruled by apes and human beings are their slaves is because it is Earth all along. Charlton Heston has gone forward in time, and he realizes that humanity, like Peace on Earth, has completely destroyed itself with war, and now the monkeys have taken over. But he also wrote the movie 7 Days in May, which is about an attempted military coup to remove a liberal president from office because of his plans to engage in a pact with the Soviet Union for unilateral nuclear disarmament. So he's discharged from the army in 1946. He uses his GI benefits to enroll in college. He initially pursued a degree in physical education, but his extracurricular interests in the theater and in radio convinced him to change his major to a Bachelor of the Arts in Literature, which he got in 1950. He eventually married his girlfriend, Louise Kramer. This isn't really apropos of anything. I just thought it was a funny little anecdote. Like, his relationship with the Army was not entirely over. For extra cash during college, he did part-time test work, testing out parachutes for the Army Air Forces, and he received $50 per successful jump. And the way you would pay the parachute testers, who were hired as independent contractors, the way you paid them is you paid them half up front and half if they survived the test. And and basically the amount you were paid would go up depending on how hazardous the test was. I think it was just a week before he was supposed to get his degree. Just a week before he was supposed to get married, he got $1,000 for participating in the testing of a jet ejection seat that had killed the previous 3 people who had tested it. So, a guy not necessarily good in war, but, he had some stones. He didn't seem like a guy who was particularly afraid of anyone or anything. But he worked in radio throughout the 40s before transitioning to television, and his first big break came in 1955 after the broadcast of a teleplay he wrote on the Kraft television theater called Patterns. It's basically a sort of corporate thriller. It's about a older man in a company who's being challenged by a younger man who has all of these big ideas about modernizing and making the business more successful. And the episode itself was very successful with both critics and audiences, particularly because Serling was able to blend a certain element of mystery and suspense into the drama, and also it offered a kind of social commentary to it. And so that's how he becomes a hot commodity, and he followed that up in 1956 with something called Requiem for a Heavyweight for the Playhouse 90, also very successful. And then also for Playhouse 90, one of his most acclaimed teleplays of that time was called A Town Has Turned to Dust, which was an anti-racist thriller about the lynching of Mexicans in a small southwestern town. So already we start to see, commensurate with his critical and popular successes, Serling challenging the corporate censorship of television of the time, which was incredibly opposed to anything that would even smack of being controversial or polemical or taking a side really in anything, and using television as a medium to explore philosophical issues or issues of social justice. And so when we come to the Twilight Zone, it emphasized sort of high concept oddities and twists, and it was also, of course, more explicit in exploring philosophical, social, and political concepts. But, the Twilight Zone wasn't a huge success at the time. It struggled throughout its 5-season run. It was canceled no less than 3 times because, it had moderate ratings, but more often, it basically was only able to survive as long as it did, not because it achieved a kind of mass appeal, but because it developed one of the first sort of cult followings of a TV show, just a hardcore base of science fiction and fantasy fans who, they really gravitated towards the fact that, Serling was one of the first people who was using science fiction and horror and fantasy not as an exploitation vehicle. He was presenting it as dramatically serious.
Right, just how to tell a story.
Right. Yeah.
So he tells a story woven into a fable. Right.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
Right.
And so, that's more or less the build-up, like, how, it almost is a moot point to even dwell on, like, why the Twilight Zone has the sort of popular infamy that it does, because it is a very well-made show for the most part. But this episode in particular, The Night of the Meek, it's the 11th episode of the series' 2nd season. It stars Art Carney as a department store Santa named Henry Corwin, who has
unemployed.
Yeah, he becomes recently unemployed because he's basically an alcoholic, and the reason he drinks is because he's basically living in a very poor part of the city that he lives in, and so every day he sees the really dire state of poverty and inequality in the place that he lives, and he finds it impossible to reconcile that with, you know, the character he plays.
I'm an aging, purposeless relic of another time, and I live in a dirty rooming house on a street filled with hungry kids and shabby people, where the only thing that comes down the chimney on Christmas Eve is more poverty.
Will you keep your voice
That's
down?
why I drink, Mr. Dundee. And that's why I weep.
On his way walking home, you know, just bleary-eyed stumbling through the streets, he comes along what looks like a bag of just trash, but then he looks again and he realizes that it's suddenly magically filled with gifts. And so that begins the plot of the episode, where he basically becomes Santa for an evening, where he takes the bag everywhere he goes, particularly to the poorer people, you know, the people who are at like the Salvation Army services, and to the poor kids who are living in the tenements, and he gives them each one gift, and it's whatever their heart's desire is. He's apprehended by the police because when the cop catches him, he assumes that these are goods he's stolen from the department store, but then during the when the department store manager comes in, they can't pull gifts out of the bag. When they open it, all they see is trash, and so it's only him who can pull the stuff out. So he goes free, and the climax of the episode is that the bag is emptied out, and he thinks, all right, well, that's over. But then he turns a corner, and a sleigh with reindeer has appeared, and an elf greets him and, you know, basically says, yep, you're Santa Claus, it's time to go back to the North Pole so that we can prepare for next year. It's a very optimistic example of the Twilight Zone, isn't it? Because we don't normally associate the Twilight Zone with optimistic endings, do we?
I mean, I wished it seemed like Art Carney's portrayal is absolutely wonderful. And he looks like he's the only serious actor in the whole bit.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate. The other guys look like they're reading from cue cards.
Well,
it's really disappointing because there really isn't there's no one to play off of.
Yeah, the character who plays the department store owner, what's his name?
He's a good actor. He's not a bad actor.
Yeah, Mr. Dundee, played by John Fielder. Like a lot of you will recognize him. He's the neighborhood. He's the neighborhood association spokesperson in A Raisin in the Sun. He's juror number 2 in 12 Angry Men.
Yep, he's got
really fantastic character actor. He also was the voice of Piglet in Disney's Winnie the Pooh cartoon. So yeah, he's a very good actor. But it's exactly like you're saying, where
something about what happened there. I don't quite understand and what happens is it washes out. Carney then seems more like he's overacting. The contrast can't be greater. Everything. I was really disappointed in the fact that no one
there's a big difference between the opening scene, which is fantastic, where he's at the bar just getting liquored up. He's already an hour late for his job, and he almost gets the bartender threatens to break his shoulders because he attempts to steal a bottle of booze from the bar. Or to sneak out with it. And there's this, like you're saying, it's like that is a very well acted scene because it's playing to the strength of how Carney takes the role very seriously. But then as soon as John Fielder comes in as Mr. Dundee, and then especially when the cop comes into play, there's this weird, like, almost oafish comedy going on that just doesn't work. And I think in some ways it almost exudes a kind of overcompensating.
Yeah.
Because, like, if you were to just present it as the story of a drunk guy who finds a magic bag and is giving out gifts, like, there's a premise here that, just like any Twilight Zone episode, it could come off as incredibly disturbing. Because the first part of it is, okay, is this guy really handing out a magic bag, or is he just, like, so loaded now that he's just hallucinating things? Is he now schizophrenic? But then when you find out that the bag is actually a magic bag that can produce whatever your heart desires, suddenly that's like, oh my god, that's horrific. Where did this bag come from? You know, it's like this complete, but like it seems to me, and that's how, I think that's how I interpret it.
Right. I was just like,
Is that it's
like I said,
overcompensating for the fact that, you know, I think Serling very much wanted this to be a more sentimental and optimistic and sort of spirit of the season, because it's a Christmas special. Like, he wanted to make something that was both more artistically rigorous, but totally accessible to a mass audience. But I think in the process, it's like what you're saying, there becomes this contradiction where the sentimentality is overcompensating for what really should have just been left to the tragedy of the story. Like, everything to do with Art Carney, like when he's on his own with children or with the other drunkards on the in the city, like all of that stuff is fantastic. But when it comes to, you know, you could totally cut Mr. Dundee or the cop out of the story and you wouldn't lose anything.
You wouldn't lose that. Yeah, right, exactly. You'd be sure.
Like, you know, could you imagine a scene where instead of him being arrested, like a bunch of poor teenagers mug him in an alley to get his bag, but then they find out it's just filled with coal. You know, like that would have been funny.
Trash.
The trash, or make it an actual joke. You know, it's like that would have. I'm just saying that would have been funny.
A word to the wise to all the children of the 20th century, whether their concern be pediatrics or geriatrics, whether they crawl on hands and knees and wear diapers, or walk with a cane and comb their beards. There's a wondrous magic to Christmas, and there's a special power reserved for little people. In short, there's nothing mightier than the meek. And a Merry Christmas to each and all.
You know, there's this obvious, you know, moral to the episode, which is kind of a very formulaic one for not just, you know, Christmas TV specials, but like Christmas novelty popular culture in general, especially in America, where it's this perceived contradiction between the essence of Christmas as a holiday, of speaking to the inherent virtue of people, to neighborliness, to charity, to everything that is the best in human beings, and the reality that Art Carney experiences firsthand, which is that, no, I'm just going to a department store to sell a bunch of overpriced shit to kids who don't appreciate it. And then I'm going to go back to the place where the people who need this sort of joy the most are just never going to get it, because this is all a consumer enterprise.
Will you please leave?
But as for my insubordination, I was not rude to that woman. Someone should remind her that Christmas is more than barging up and down department store aisles and pushing people out of the way.
Now, Corwin...
Someone has to tell her that Christmas is another thing finer than that. Richer, finer, truer. And it should come with patience and love, charity, compassion.
And so it occurred to me as I was watching it that this is like the most popular and common type of Christmas novelty pop, at least as far as television and theater, which is the story about how Christmas itself is being threatened by materialism and by consumerism. And so it occurs to me that despite the fact that we could pretty much say that, yes, Christmas is basically just a consumer enterprise at this point. There's no relationship between it necessarily and any kind of virtue. But, you know, the fact of the matter remains that the way that Christmas is sold in a lot of these specials, including in The Night of the Meek, is by emphasizing that fact. Like, it seems like one of the most popular and successful ways in which Christmas is sold to a mass audience, the precise way it's the most effectively commercialized, is the same way that all commercials work, where a commercial doesn't work just because you put something on the screen and tell someone, hey, wouldn't you like this? The way advertising works the best is when you subtly imply to the person who's watching it something is missing in your life. You know, there's something that you can't get, but this product will give to you. And we see that exactly in all these Christmas specials, whether it's a Charlie Brown Christmas or How the Grinch Stole Christmas or even stuff like A Miracle on 34th Street. The way these are sold is you as an audience are already accessible to the notion that the essence of Christmas, this pure thing that you associate with your childhood, is somewhere in the remote past, and that all you need is X product and it will give you back this thing that you think you've lost. And so that was something that like I sort of became aware of while watching The Night of the Meek, because it, in a way, like, you know, Serling had developed a reputation, and he keeps this reputation as an artist of being someone who was oppositional to conservative society, whether it was war or whether it was bigotry or whether it was, you know, materialism. But I think what The Night of the Meek exemplifies is just how reactionary most of the Twilight Zone actually is. Because there's this critique of consumerism, sure, but the solution to it is all predicated upon there being this miraculous moment where, like, you know, God just makes some drunkard from the slums Santa Claus. But as far as the actual problem, which is that, you know, the problem of Christmas Day is not the emotional issue. It's not that people's emotional needs aren't being met. It's a resource issue. The poor people are not getting anything. They're, you know, they're marginalized and segregated and don't have access to anything. It sort of occurred to me that, you know, you could interpret a lot of the Twilight Zone that way, where there is this so much of this emphasis on personal moral failings, or at the very least this idea that there are elements of human nature that are endemic, that are the cause of these grand problems, rather than any sort of particular critique of systems, so to speak, and how they can be unjust, and, you know, ultimately how they can be rectified or reformed in some way. And I wanted to get your bead on, like, when you think about the Twilight Zone, like,
I just think it's a good story. I mean, it's all right. It's all right. It's not one of his better ones, but I don't know. It just seems like there's a mismatch. There's something out of. I don't quite understand how it is. There's no subtlety.
yeah.
You know, he pulls a bottle of 29 sherry for his boss, right? Out
For
of the
Mr.
bag.
Dundee, yeah.
Yeah, or whatever it's called. I forget
Yeah.
if it was sherry. And all of a sudden, he's walking down the street with the cop saying,
You better come home with me, and we'll pour out some hot coffee, and we'll pour some brandy in it, and we'll thank God for miracles, Flaherty.
It's a shame because of Art Carney's really solid performance in this. He was a very good actor, although, you know, most of his stuff was done with Jackie Gleason in The Honeymooners, and he played a buffoon. But he had some really good acting creds that, this is one place where he could have shined if he had the right, you know, contrapuntal from the actors that are working opposite him, the main characters. I just thought it was.
Yeah, I just think it's particular.
It's all right.
Yeah,
It's okay.
yeah. Like I really like the episode, and it's one that
it's a good episode.
You know, it's like I'm incredibly attracted to it, and like, you know, again, a lot of Art Carney's scenes are just brutal.
Well, here's the other thing: is that what's interesting? Yes, and what's interesting, you almost could smell the piss and the alcohol. He's so good at it.
Yeah, he does a great.
You can smell the dirt.
You almost wonder if he's not acting.
Right. You almost can smell it. That's how good he is. You can smell the liquor on his breath. You can smell his body odor. Those kinds of things. That's how
the
good
production design is also very good. Like his Santa suit is the perfect middle ground between just the sort of cheap thing that a department store would give an actor as a costume.
It isn't kept well.
Right. There's no.
It's all flat.
Yeah. There's no pretense. Like, you know, no one is fooled that this guy's Santa. Not even the kids. But that's the interesting thing is that, like, you know, and.
It just seems that that's what was lost in this particular episode.
One other, like, the complete opposite of the previous hypothetical rewrite that I proposed, where you just take Dundee out of the picture entirely after he fires Carney's character. The opposite way I think of going about it would be to keep that plot device of Carney being suspected of having stolen gifts from the department store, and rather than that being just a mistake, that the cop calls Dundee in, and Dundee, without it actually checking if any inventory was stolen, just comes in and immediately presumes that he has been stolen from. The way you actually make the story a lot more interesting is every time that Art Carney pulls into this bag and gives people what they desire the most, suddenly inventory from department stores all over, the city are magically disappearing. Like, that's how you make the story a little more,
right,
and not just more interesting dramatically, but also,
yeah,
give it a kind of point where it's not just the sentimentality of like, oh, the spirit of Christmas. It's like, no, fuck the spirit of Christmas. Let's have like something that's actually polemical and controversial and upsetting. And that's the thing that I keep coming back to, is how this episode makes me realize I can do this with a lot of Twilight Zone episodes, where it's just like, it's all working towards these magical conclusions, or, and whether they're nightmare endings or happy dream endings, it all comes back to this way Serling presents the issue as being, which is that there's no systemic critique. He has oppositions to feelings in the same way that Peace on Earth has this opposition to the feelings that manifest war, but there's no material there. There's nothing holding together what are causing these processes, and it makes it a very, not a very disappointing episode, but it's one of those things where it's like you think about it for 5 seconds and you start to say, this is kind of junk.
Right.
Enjoyable junk, though, I feel like. There is this I forget who said it, but it's become kind of this generation of sort of radical or fringe leftists, one of their sort of favorite aphorisms of the 21st century, which is the idea that it is easier for people in this late stage of capitalism to imagine the total destruction of the entire earth. It's easier for us to imagine that than to imagine a much more modest change in the political economy and how resources are distributed and how relations are formed. And I think we can see that as emblematic in the sort of through line between Peace on Earth and Night of the Meek, where Peace on Earth, explicitly, it is much easier for the creators to imagine that humanity totally destroys one another than to imagine the much more modest scenario in which we say, well, wars don't just happen. They happen because there are political processes at work, and what we need to do is change those political processes so that wars are less likely. And here with even, with Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone, this very pacifistic artist, the guy who makes 7 Days in May, it's like, it's much easier to imagine this miraculous thing that saves the essence of human nature from the darkness than the much more modest solution, which is that, why don't we just steal from the department stores and give the resources to those who actually need them, rather than, investing our hopes in these sort of quasi-religious allegories. Why don't we take a brief break, and then when we come back, we're going to get into the one that I'm looking the most forward to asking you about, just because of how much you disdained it. We're going to be talking about one of my favorite Christmas movies of all time, Santa Claus Conquers the Martians.
I've been wondering, what is this strange little creature over here?
Oh, Winky made that. That's his idea of a Martian.
A Martian? Wowie wow, I'd hate to meet a creature like that on a dark night. I wonder if there really are people on Mars.
Well, who knows?
Christmas time and I want presents. Roast beast, I want roast pheasant. Deck the halls with gin and whiskey. Yuletide cheer makes me all frisky. 'Tis the season to be sassy. It's the reason to stay nasty. It's Christmas time and I ain't doing fine. Forget the season cheer, it only makes me feel weird. It's depressing, it's messing with me. I'm dressed in my best and I feel I wish it was New Year. Gotta go, my drink is here. String the lights up, Mrs. Claus. Serve the ham on all four paws. Roast the chestnut, spike the punch. Save that turkey for my lunch. It's Christmas time and I ain't doing fine. Forget the season cheer, it only makes me feel weird. It's depressing, it's messing with me. I'm dressed in my best and I feel I wish it was New Year. Gotta go, my drink is. It's Christmas time and I ain't doing fine. Forget the season cheer, it only makes me feel weird. It's depressing, it's messing with me. I'm dressed in my best and I feel I wish it was New Year. Gotta go, my drink is here. Christmas, Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, seasons drinking's what I love. The halls of Christmas cheer, vodka cherry, something queer. Fa la 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 la. Here's the reason to stay nasty. It's Christmas time and I ain't doing fine. Forget the season cheer, it only makes me feel weird. It's depressing, it's messing with me. I'm dressed in my best and I feel I wish it was New Year. Gotta go, my drink is. It's Christmas time and I ain't doing fine. Forget the season cheer, it only makes me feel weird. It's depressing, it's messing with me. I'm dressed in my best and I feel I wish it was New Year. Gotta go, my drink is here.
We are back. So, just to start things off, immediate impressions from you about Santa Claus Conquers the Martians. You did not seem fond of it once the whole, not just once the whole thing was over. Throughout it, you were decidedly unenamored with the movie. It seemed like.
Well, I don't know. It just seems like it. I don't know. It's not one of the. Well, I would never want to see it again. That's for sure. It's a painful experience to sit through. I mean, it's not surprising that it got like 28% on Rotten Tomatoes. I was really surprised. What's so painful is the amount of detail they went into making it read. Every part of the script moved correctly if it were just as a script, without any scenery, and they were just reading it. So if they had a reading exercise, it may have been better. It's how poorly it was put together.
You feel like you would have been more entertained just watching the cast read the
Exactly.
script than necessarily seeing the movie.
That's exactly right. Without seeing what they tried to do to illustrate the scene by scene. Because, other than that, the script isn't a bad script. The lines are not bad. So,
well,
insert if you heard it on the radio as if it were 1930s,
like a radio play,
right?
Yeah, like
then and just had sound effects, then you would have, it would be okay. But I don't know. It's just the monstrosity of a, it's all right.
Yeah, your feelings about it aren't too far from the way that most people view it. I'm going to be my typical contrarian self, and I'm going to argue that not only is Santa Claus Conquers the Martians a good film, but it is one of the few actually good pieces of Christmas novelty popular culture that exists. with the stipulation that I do not think that the reasons that it is good are in any of the ways that are intended by the filmmakers. You know, and I've said this before multiple times on the podcast that this is not a so bad it's good podcast. This is not a one where we're just out to make fun of low budget movies. But I do think, you know, if you're going to talk about Santa Claus Conquers the Martians, it's already coming with its own level of special infamy in terms of so bad it's good film culture, because, you know, the movie itself was independently produced. It was distributed by a company called Embassy Pictures, which before the 1960s they were primarily a distribution company, and, you know, they distributed a lot of rather conventional genre movies. They particularly distributed a lot of Italian sword and sandals movies.
They were equally bad. Hercules, 1958. You know, it was color, I think, but it was equally bad. It was an Italian film.
But they also distributed
that, yes.
They also distributed like a lot of like in their heyday from the late 40s to the early 60s. They distributed a lot of really acclaimed movies by directors like Akira Kurosawa, Ingmar Bergman, Vittorio De Sica, Federico Fellini, Jean-Luc Godard. You know, they were not like a Penny Annie outfit that were only doing like foreign pickups of exploitation movies. And eventually they did go into film production, and, you know, their most successful movie was 1967's The Graduate, after which point the company was sold to the Avco Corporation, which is as far as I can tell, is like a munitions and weapons contractor, and that's a particularly dark period in Hollywood, once, like, you know, non-movie related companies just start buying out distributors and producers as part of like a conglomeration process. But anyway, yes, Embassy, you know, they have a sort of pedigree behind them despite anything, and it seems like, you know, but Santa Claus Conquers the Martians, after it was initially released, and presumably sometime after the Avco Corporation bought the company, it just fell into the public domain. Like, apparently of all the movies that they had the distribution rights to, shockingly, they did not think that Santa Claus Conquers the Martians was something that was particularly worth protecting the rights to.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was, as a cult film, it probably took off, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it, because once something enters the public domain, that means that anybody has the right to duplicate or broadcast it, and so that's how Santa Claus Conquers the Martians becomes a sort of public domain cult hit, where it's mostly shown on late night TV seasonally, usually by local access channels, and so it sort of develops from there, particularly in the 80s, a cult following and a reputation as one of the worst movies of all time. It first gained a lot of notoriety when it was featured on the 1986 late night movie sketch theater series Cannes Film Festival, but then especially in 1991 it was featured in Mystery Science Theater 3000, which has a cult following over all its own. So it definitely develops this cult infamy. But the part of the movie that appeals to me, you know, we're now at the point where I don't know if the movie is still in the public domain, but we've reached the point now where even the most marginal and reviled of movies, often the ones that are considered, like, you know, the best of the worst, like the top 100 worst movies ever made, even these movies nowadays, like, you'll have lots of alternative or niche video distribution companies not just releasing the films, but like meticulously restoring them. And so the print that we watched this holiday was one that was produced by Kino Lorber, which is a German company that is primarily known for distributing international art house movies, and apparently they felt it was worthy of their time to actually restore the film, because previously the only way you could watch Santa Claus Conquers the Martians was in decidedly low quality, not pan and scanned, but, VHS quality, multi-dubbed videos. And so the way you and I have watched it is pretty close to as close to pristine as you're going to get. Because even the print that we watched, however much it was restored, there was obviously a lot of degradation on the film, particularly on the right side of the film. It seemed like a lot of the color it seemed like a lot of it had been washed out. Like it seemed like the camera negative was not preserved in the best way. Right. But nonetheless, and I think it is interesting that given that we in this generation have the opportunity to see the movie in this sort of, some might argue undeserved, but nonetheless pristine way of seeing it. For me, at least, it was kind of a revelation in terms of, despite how, incredibly low the production value of the movie is, like nothing in the movie is convincing, but I did become aware of just, now seeing it in a restored version, I began to appreciate that, for its low budget, a lot of the production design and the cinematography of the film is, it's conducive to the low budget. It's an example where they definitely had people who were working on it, who were trying to do the best with the limited resources that they had, and particularly in the opening sequences of Mars, I thought a lot of the production design, for as hokey and unconvincing as it was, like especially when the Martians go to visit like the 800-year-old Martian sage. A lot of those scenes, they're like legitimately well shot and very atmospheric. And I don't know that it necessarily translated, at least for anyone who isn't me and whose brain isn't rotted by these movies, that to make it like that much more entertaining. But I at least had a new respect for it as a piece of low budget filmmaking.
Yeah, I think I have to agree that the shooting was very adequate for the, it completely masked the whole subject matter and the acting. But you're right. Even close-ups, cuts, takes, things like that, I think you're right. I think you're right about the editing and stuff like that went into it. You're right. It's not. Yeah. But it's just why?
Yeah, why? Why Santa Claus Conquers the Martians?
Why?
And I think at the end of the day, we're just going to have to accept the fact that we don't know why. Like, apparently the movie only really came into fruition as a result. It was kind of the pet project of a producer named Paul L. Jacobson. I looked him up on IMDb. I could not find any other credits. Basically, his lasting contribution to cinema is Santa Claus Conquers the Martians.
I think the main actor in it who plays Zirkin, that was his only film. Or Kieran, whatever his name, the head guy. Kemar, yeah.
Leonard Hicks, yeah. But here's the other weird thing about it. Apparently, like, the most of the cast of it was...
Well, there's one guy,
Vincent Beck, who plays Voldar the villain.
The idiot kid.
Drapo. Bill McCutcheon.
Yeah, he's popular. I've seen him.
He's sort of a comic character
actor. I remember him on Captain
actor.
Kangaroo out of Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it was out of Philadelphia.
Yeah, so a lot of the cast of the movie, or at least the adult cast, were either people who were or would become sort of character actors in TV.
Right.
But also
musicals and Broadway.
Yep. And that's the other thing, is that a lot of these actors, like, they're called, like, the movie itself was apparently primarily shot on one sound stage, which was just a derelict airplane hangar in Long Island.
You didn't need to, right?
Right. So, they drew a lot of their cast from people who were Broadway actors.
Right.
And the thing that needs to be said about that is that the actors, like, despite the script and despite the poverty of the production, they do bring their A game here.
Oh, like, no, the acting is their acting is okay.
It's part of what keeps it entertaining. Right. Is that, like, you have a guy like Leonard Hicks.
You really are believing this?
Yeah, exactly. He's committed. It's like, and it's very admirable. He's not phoning it in. He's, like, actually trying to say these absurd. And I think the way that it works is that I think a lot of the actors, whether it's
here's what I'm trying to say. I don't think the lines are absurd. I think the lines, like I said,
there's a bluntness to it.
The,
like
reading of it would be fine. There's no difference between this and Star Trek. In many ways.
That's what's going to get the nerds upset at you.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that if you took Star Trek's quality and transposed it with this kind of lyricism of the...
Which was often not that much higher budget
Not much, no. They're using a salt shaker as one of their things to determine whether you're sick or not. That Dr. McCoy used all the time. Yeah. It was all right. I mean, I just thought it was very painful for me to sit through because... For me, when I look at a film, I don't look at the elements. I don't pay much attention. I paid much more attention to the storyline and also to the degree of acting and the realism. When one of those components falls apart, then it's more difficult for me to stay engrossed in other attributes of a film.
Right.
And you pick up, and I have to admit, you're right. I think given the restoration quality of the film, a lot of the shots were somewhat done well. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Even the cave scene with
there's almost like oracle, an expressionistic quality of it.
Yes, there is. The oracle, there had to be, right?
Yeah.
Because the set was so cheap, you had to do something.
They're just they're just in a derelict hangar, and they did a good job of making it look like...
Get that focus in really close to something, and then blur it out a little bit.
Lots of fog. Let's use lots of...
a lot of carbon dioxide.
lots of chiaroscuro colored lighting with lots of primary colors. Yeah.
Right.
And I guess that does get down to it's what you're saying, where it does get down to the bare rub of it, because the movie does have this reputation of being one of the worst movies of all time, but when you break down any individual element of it, all right, cinematography or production design,
step by step, it's fine.
Exactly,
step by step, it's fine.
Even as far as the level of the script, I know that we kind of disagree on it, but I don't really have an objection to the script.
No, I
because
don't either.
I think the script is written in such a way that's motivated by the fact that most of the characters are just these absurd, one-dimensionally drawn figures, and it's deliberate. And especially with the Martians, I think the whole point is that they talk like aliens. They talk like people who have no relation. They talk like the actors are talking like they're not performing for people. They're talking like that this is just the way that Martians behave and talk, which is very, very...
formalized.
Yeah, very formalized and very monotone.
Where's Kemar? He should be here any moment. What's this all about?
We'll find out when Kemar arrives. We are probably going to seek the advice of Chochem.
What does Kemar think we are? A kindergarten class? Can't we make our own decisions? Must we always come crawling to that doddering old man?
Chochem is 800 years old. You can't dismiss the wisdom of centuries.
I can.
Very formalized kind of speaking that's not colloquial.
Right.
Or less fluid. And it comes off fine. I have nothing wrong with it. I think there's nothing wrong with the dialogue.
So then it comes down to but there is something about it, because that's the thing that I'm saying is especially when you see the restored print, when you break down any individual element, there's clearly a motivated and artistically credible reason for it to be that way, regardless of whether you think the content necessarily is worthy of it. But at the end of the day, there is something there that can't just be boiled down to the technical quality of the production. There's something that is genuinely unnerving about the film. By the end of it, I was laughing out loud, but I wasn't laughing because I found anything in it circumstantially funny. None of the comic bits in the movie are funny in and of themselves. But I just kept laughing, because I didn't know how else to react. I felt like I was having a psychotic breakdown just because of how absurd everything was getting.
Like I said, I think some of the, I don't know. I just think that like I said, it would work. It would work as a cartoon.
Yeah.
Animated. I just don't.
But then we don't get the stark, brute address of it as being done in cheap live action. And that's the thing. I think there is a genuinely unnerving quality of the film where, despite the fact that it is so the plot of the movie is Martian society, the children of Mars are becoming obsessed with with Earth, i.e. American television, and particularly as Christmas is approaching, Santa Claus. And so the Martian sage tells the chief of the Martians, what's his name? The names don't matter, but he tells the chief of the Martians, you have to...
He's like an oracle, he appears.
Right, he appears, he's 800 years old, and he's saying, like, basically it's the whole thing of, like, the innocence of children, right?
We have no children on Mars. They have children's bodies, but with adult minds. They do not have a childhood. I've seen this coming for centuries. They are born. Our electronic teaching machines are attached to their brains while they are in their cradles. Information is fed into their minds in a constant stream. And by the time they can walk, they are adults. They've never played. They've never learned to have fun. And now they are rebelling.
The conflict of the film comes where between Kimar, the leader of the Martians, and Voldar, played by
who says "bah," almost "bah humbug."
Yeah, literally, like he's a bah humbug. Yeah, he's our humbug figure. He's our Scrooge.
He's more malevolent.
He's more malevolent because he wants Martian society to remain exactly the same. Right. But Kimar ultimately decides, all right, what we need to do is we need to go to Earth and kidnap Santa Claus and bring him to Mars so that he can make these dumb children happy. And that way we can preserve the stability of our society. Because
they're not eating.
Right. Yeah, I forgot that part. They're actually abstaining from eating.
They're not abstaining. Just they have no appetite anymore.
Right.
And so they're worried that the children are not going to thrive enough to.
Right.
So there's an existential problem.
There's an existential problem. But as Voldar brings up, is that like they're going to become a nuisance. Like, it's like we want the children to be this way because it's convenient for us and it maintains our society in this regimented way. So, like you're saying...
But it isn't regimented, because Kimar and what's the bad guy?
Voldar.
And you have the two idiots played by...
Drapo is Bill McCutcheon.
And the other idiot.
There's another idiot?
Yeah, the other guy who's in there too.
Again, the names don't matter.
But the point is that they're all individual different people that are more pliable and more... gullible.
Right.
And you have the more... So all this
it's
kind
a farce,
It's a farce.
Yeah.
All this unity that never really occurs. I mean, there isn't like this... They're not monochromatic.
Yeah. So they kidnap Santa.
It's just bizarre, absurd.
Yeah. They kidnap Santa, but not before kidnapping two Earth children.
Right.
Who are apparently in Central Park somewhere and just like listening to the radio. And they kidnap them because they want to... First, they ask them where Santa lives, and then they're like, all right, we need to take these kids with us because we don't want them telling the Earth people what we're up to. And so
Which is strange, because the announcer knows they've been kidnapped by Martians. Now, how did they figure that out?
Well, they know that Martians are in the air. Like, the spaceship is around. Like, that's the thing. That's a refreshing thing about the plotting of the movie. Despite the fact of how absurd and farcical everything is, it does mean that, like, everyone is just, like, on the nose. Like, nobody is ever confused. There's never a moment where anyone's scratching their chin of what to do. Like, right after, like, the Martians kidnap Santa, like, we're literally told that, yeah, technically we still need to test the technology of sending a rocket up into space to chase the Martians down. But guess what? We're gonna go anyway, because we're not giving up Santa.
Mr. Von Green, what is the space agency doing about this?
Well, we have mobilized all the men and equipment in our Starshot project. And we have rushed our astronauts into an intensive program for the final phase of their training. Now our Starshot ship is supposed to undergo 6 months of test flights. But we are going to forget about the testing and go after those Martian monkeys.
Isn't that risky?
Of course it is risky. But every one of our astronauts is begging for the chance to go after the Martians. who wouldn't give everything to bring Santa back to our children.
And it's refreshing in that regard.
It is.
But anyway, they successfully get Santa back to Mars. They basically put him in charge.
By the way, let me tell you that's here it's bravura, bravado.
It's just bravado.
Yeah,
but
we'll just go up there because we have to rescue Santa Claus.
But it almost works as like a parody of exactly that sort of mentality because it doesn't work. The Martians do get away. You know, like nothing the Earthlings do. Like that's the other.
What happens to that spaceship?
Yeah, exactly. What happened to them? Did they die? What happened? But that's the other thing is that like there's the plotting of the movie.
And they're all going into the air with these rocket ships and these planes.
Right.
For what? They can't find them anymore.
That's the thing is that the plotting of the movie is so bizarre because ostensibly the conflict becomes Santa is a prisoner on Mars. Like they treat him very well. Like, you know, they treat him civilly. So Santa is a prisoner of Mars and they have no way of getting back to Earth. And Voldar is basically made a prisoner because he keeps undermining the mission and at several points attempts to have like the children or Santa killed.
Right, but pushing them out into space.
Right, but yeah, he wants to push them out into an air shoot them out of the airlock like the alien.
Right,
yeah.
right.
You know, it's like a quick way of getting. But yeah,
like
so
when they kill it, the terror from beyond space, they try to open the door to let the radiation in. I mean,
he's arrested and thrown into a prison. It's never actually explained how this prison works because there's no guards. They just live. It seems like there's literally just one. Like all the Martians live underground like ants.
Yes.
And so there's one catacomb where they put all of their prisoners. But there's no guards. Like Voldar and the other people he's conspiring with.
They're ostracized, like to an island.
Yeah, they just leave. They just leave the prison.
It's a gulag.
Yeah, exactly. It's a gulag that doesn't work.
But it's underground.
Right. Yeah, we have the establishment of that conflict. The first is Santa Claus is stuck a prisoner of Mars, and so are the children. And Voldar is going to do everything in his power to try to destroy Santa and bring Mars back to normal. But the problem is that in terms of plotting, nothing really happens. Because Santa Claus himself doesn't ever lift a finger or do anything. He seems like it's almost to an extent that he's so benign and like comical that he just accepts his position. He treats everyone exactly as nicely and jovially as he always did, but so
it's like Crocodile Dundee, just kids having fun.
Right,
he
exactly.
Slices them out, just some kids having fun.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a conflict, but there's no. It's not.
Right.
It's
Voldar
not plotted
accidentally opened the door. And he accidentally locked us in, and then he accidentally threw the switch to open the door.
Right.
But we made it through anyway because Santa was able to take the children
up the pipe,
even though it was so. But
Even
how did you?
Merry Christmas, everyone!
Santa Claus, you're all right. I thought you would.
Well, when Voldar accidentally left us in the airlock, and then came up here and accidentally threw the door switch, we knew we had to get out of there in a hurry, or that would be the end of us. Accidentally, of course.
So you crawled out through the air duct.
The air duct?
But the air duct is just a little... And you're so big.
Why, you're talking to Santa Claus, son.
But how?
Well, now, you wouldn't want me to tell my secret, would you? oh, poor man. He's fainted. Just like someone who's seen a ghost.
Oh, I'm Santa Claus.
Yeah, this is another one of these. And
I think
again,
it's great.
Okay,
that was a great twist.
Okay, yeah, that was a great twist.
But
here's the thing: I think this is where this is where it really starts getting into. Number one, why I'm so attracted to the movie in particular and think it's actually good, and also for the exact same reason why it has this reputation of being as bad as it is, because you see this 1964 movie, which is pretty obviously made for children. You have this impression that everything in the movie is supposed to work purely on the level of just naivety and this fairy tale logic where nothing needs to be explained. But then all you need to do as an adult is like that Santa like attains this like horrific quality to him, because the way Voldar is like looking at him after he discovers that, wait, you have the power to escape through
Portal,
as long as it's a chute,
Right.
it can be a chimney or a pipe. They don't explain if he can like get under cracks and doors or something.
Right,
But the point is that he can escape anywhere. So Santa Claus clearly has like some sort of power that is completely beyond the awareness of the Martians. But that doesn't work out as like a whimsical thing. It makes Santa Claus seem like, wait, then why isn't he doing anything to escape? Why is he
Well, he can't get out, so he can't go into outer space.
How do we know?
I know, but the point is that he can get down a chimney. So we know he goes down chimneys.
Right.
And he goes,
it's like the rules.
Oh, one
of
time
Santa.
he tells his children the story. I went down a steam pipe
Yeah.
to a ship by accident instead of a...
Yeah. And the children, and that's the other thing, the children don't laugh. Santa Claus keeps trying to tell them jokes while they're being prisoners of these Martians who could kill them, and he keeps trying to cheer them up. And that's what I'm saying, is that Santa Claus in this movie is not whimsical, and I don't care if that was deliberate or not. The point is that this is part of what makes the movie so attractive, is that it goes beyond merely patronizing children to an extent that it almost becomes like a borderline like horror movie.
Right.
Where Santa is like especially the way the actor who plays Santa, there's like lots of moments in John Call, there's lots of moments in the movie where like he breaks out into like, laughter and everyone just starts laughing along with him. But his laughter is like maniacal. Like he's laughing like a madman, like a movie villain, and it just like it completely undermines any notion that the movie is supposed to be cutesy in a way. Like it seems like it only works if you interpret it from the perspective that like, yeah, Santa Claus is like some sort of like extra dimensional like horror creature. Like the Martians aren't the real monsters. Santa Claus is the real like demonic pervasive force that just has this complete immunity to anything to do with, oh yeah, we were almost killed. Oh, it was just an accident. Wasn't that a funny joke when you almost killed us? Wasn't that funny, Voldar? Like, and that's what I think gets down to it. It's just that
I don't know, it's alright. I mean, it's okay.
It definitely attracts me about it. Like, and I could and I know you're not particularly keen on watching it again, but it is going to become, especially now that I found out how to get the Kino Lorber Blu-ray and have ordered it recently, it's definitely going to become a staple of my Christmas watching, or at least if I'm in the proper state of inebriation. But yeah, like I would definitely defend Santa Claus Conquers the Martians just on the basis of not just technically speaking and motivated, everything is done at least modestly well for its budget.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, it's so different from any other work of like these Christmas novelty pop culture things where, it's like, so let me just ask like one follow-up question. It's like, okay, do the Martians represent the inevitable future of Americans, or do they represent communism? Because I think this could go either way, and I would like, if you do have a
I have no idea. I just think they're Martians. I don't think there's any hidden meaning in it.
Well, I mean, they are like, it's like
Martians
the Red Menace, the highly structured society, the
right.
robotizing of the children.
I don't think so. Martians are meant to. It's how America looks at all foreign entities.
There's also Orientalism to it, like, especially the Martian sage. It looks like he's got like a whole Fu Manchu thing going on with him.
He turns out to be the professor in the next scene.
Yeah, he's the Peter Sellers of the production.
Right.
That I guess we should have also mentioned that, like the stock footage that's used in this movie.
My
Oh my god! Like that was one element where it's like, okay, it's hard to it's hard to justify this because how much padding?
How much padding do you really need?
Exactly.
Keep it at 34 minutes or 50 minutes or even 60 minutes and be done with it. Why pad it for any more than you need to?
There's this like the Doctor Strangelove connection is great because they even use stock footage of a plane getting its tank refilled midair.
Midair refilling. Right.
Yeah, so of course I immediately just thought of the opening credits of Doctor Strangelove, and I was like, and again, affirming to me, this is like an obscene movie. And again, it's not deliberate, but I don't mean it's not deliberate in the sense that it's unintentionally bad. I think it's a good movie, but how it works around to really being good is the non-deliberate part where the people who made this were insane. Like, they just, there's like a whole obscenity, like, to the movie where it's like, it's so crass and like, you know, just in the way that it, like, you know, like, because obviously we've been over this with the previous two, especially Night of the Meek, you know, like how Christmas is basically just a function of capitalism. It's a way to fabricate and manufacture like seasonal periods of incredible consumerism in order to make money. And, you know, the linchpin of that is, you know, teaching children from an early age to love Santa Claus, to imagine that all of these gifts that they're getting are coming from some magic source.
Right. But still capitalism, because they're generating toys for the Martians.
Right.
And that's the thing. And that's they're automated.
Okay, exactly. So that's exactly what I was trying to get to with my whole communism versus capitalism thing. What do the Martians represent? So yeah, bring us through that the Martians, in a way, do sort of seem to represent not communism with its emphasis on mechanizing children and rigorously educating them with a specific ideology that conforms them to an entire system, but they adapt immediately to this idea of like, all right, now we're just going to make a bunch of machines that produce dumb toys to keep them satiated.
Right.
So like so yeah, like I think there's an argument to be made that, again, totally unintentional, that the movie is so bizarre that it sort of unintentionally becomes a satire of and a parody of Christmas. You know, like, and
absolutely, yeah, I agree.
All right, what did we learn? What did we learn? Not
Nothing.
just today. What have we learned this season, Rocco?
The crime doesn't pay.
Yeah, crime doesn't pay. Like, you can't. Zoldar is going to be in prison for the rest of his life. I mean,
I don't think he's
No, he's going to get out because they don't have guards on the gate. I still don't understand this. How does this work as a prison?
Is it supposed to be like an atomic screen that they could turn off?
Oh, right. Oh, yeah, I forgot that part. Yeah, shocking. I forgot a part of the plot of the
reverses
movie.
The light bulbs. The idiot reverses.
No, that's how Droppo does
escapes.
It. So I forget.
No. Voldar.
Voldar brings that machine with them.
No, Voldar has it in his own cave because Zerkar, what's his name? Who's the head guy again? Kimar tells his underlings, go check the Martian River caves, because that's where Zoldar is hiding.
Oh, right. He's not really sent to prison.
Zoldar did break out.
He's fleed. He's like abdicated.
And no one shows how it happened.
Okay,
But he's not being guarded. I guess he can just walk out. I'm
doing a bad job of defending the artistic credibility of this movie and just forgetting everything that happens.
But the point is that's why I said. I said the technique of script writing and meaning, all the little pieces like the boards and the kids unplugging the boards and all these, and the guy screwing around with I know it's fake, with a monkey wrench.
Right.
But it's still, someone wrote that in the script. Okay, do this, reverse the light bulbs on this so he can run out and make sure that they think the screen's on, but it really isn't. He's able to run a dope off, is able to get off where his name is. Yeah. Right. So, I mean, that's what I meant. So technically speaking, there's nothing wrong with the script writing in terms of the scene by scene layout, and also the dialogue. I think the dialogue's spot on. I don't think there's nothing wrong. It's efficient, and it
works for being a farcical, blunt, tongue in cheek comedy.
Yeah, it does. It does.
That's what it's supposed to be.
It's just painful to watch, right?
for the unintended reasons.
Right.
Yeah. Crime. Yeah, crime does not pay.
Right.
The true monster is man,
Man.
and that's explicitly said in Peace on Earth. They were kind of like monsters.
Yep.
You know, and you know, just for this, you know, holiday. I know, like, we've taken a pretty cynical route in terms of interrogating these bits of Christmas media, but, you know, just coming personally from Monster Craze memoirs, even from our unhallowed den over one of the 7 gates of hell conveniently located in Trenton, New Jersey. I just want to say to all...
Pia Zadora, we have to give a shout out to Pia Zadora.
Yeah, she plays one of the
children.
Girmar, one of Kimar's children.
And she was voted one of the worst actresses of all time, the Golden Globes or someone.
Yeah,
she
did not have a happy life.
No, she's all right. I mean, she's okay.
No.
She's been in a number of films.
I'm looking at the Wikipedia page for personal life, and someone fell on hard times. But anyway, yes, but as far as the season
I think
goes,
she's somewhere in Nevada now, or maybe New Mexico. But she was a hot ticket item in her film Butterfly, I believe.
Yeah, where she got a Golden Globe for New Star of the Year,
Right.
as well as a Golden Raspberry for Worst Actress and Worst New Star for the same
Absolutely
performance.
the worst. I mean, she's horrible. I think she did a spread for Playboy. I can't remember if she did or didn't.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Anyway, but you know, as far as the season, you know...
But she's only 66.
Rocco,
Like
enough with Pia Zadora all the way. Okay? She was a child in this movie. We can let her... Right. We can let that aspect of her...
But that's one of her filmography things.
Okay, but I'm trying to trying to tell our lovely listeners that, you know...
We're done.
We're for the season, you know... I know we've been pretty cynical, but, you know... Right. Whether it's with your family or your friends, you know... hold each other, you know, try to work through this crazy, messed up, muddled up world of ours. And, you know, even if you don't have any particular fondness for Christmas itself, you know, just use it as an excuse.
Yeah, watch this movie.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely watch Santa Claus Conquers the Martians. That'll cheer you right up.
Right.
All right. Merry Christmas, everybody, and have a happy New Year from us at Monster Craze Memoirs.
I always watch out. I can't help but cry. I'm gonna go pout, and I'm telling you why. Santa Claus ain't coming to Mars. Santa Claus ain't coming to Mars. Santa Claus. Santa Claus. Santa Claus. Santa Claus ain't coming. Santa Claus ain't coming to Mars. We're not on his list. We don't even have ice. What's it matter who's naughty or nice? We work on hydroponics, live in a biosphere, keep the generator fueled, just so we don't die out here. So why don't you watch out? I need a good cry. I am sorry to shout, but I am telling you why. Santa Claus ain't coming to Mars. No, Santa Claus ain't coming to Mars. 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 Hey.
What's that sound? What's that sound? Santa Claus.
Santa Claus. Santa Claus. Santa Claus. Santa Claus.
What's that sound? Santa Claus. Santa Claus ain't coming. Santa Claus ain't coming to Mars. Santa Claus. Santa Claus. Claus incoming to Mars, to Mars, to Mars, to Mars, to Mars, to Mars.